Have you ever seen everyone get so hyped over how exquisite and well-made a period drama is, only to watch it and go like, hi and welcome to TV period dramas you think had good costuming but actually don't. Now to avoid anyone getting upset, let's just state that for the purpose of this video, here's what I mean by good costuming. It's completely subjective. Costumes that bring something new and fresh to the table, that are not generic, that reflect the world and the characters well, while also playing with the historical era that the show is set in. Costumes that like really dig into the historical nuances while at the same time remaining the creative liberties. Costumes that cleverly use color, texture, fabric weight to convey the message. Costumes that are not desperately trying to appeal to modern audiences, and costumes that fit well. So this is not an invitation for you to go and bash the designers because they've done a marvelous job on most of these. Here is me just nitpicking. So on that note, we're gonna start off with Peaky Blinders. But before we dig into that, since we're already sort of getting in this 1920s mood, if you're looking for 1920s style entertainment that is perhaps a little more relaxing than handsome gangsters committing homicide, how about June's Journey? Okay, not gonna lie, I was like, yeah, June's Journey, the game, everyone knows it, and then I downloaded it for free on my phone. And turns out this game is kind of made for me because it's just the right amount of excitement to not stress me out, which is amazing. So June's Journey is a free to download hidden object mystery game set in the 1920s, and basically the main character June is trying to solve a family mystery and find out who killed her sister. And with each new scene, not only you follow the story, but you also discover new settings, new locations. There is a diverse set of characters, some of which, dare I say, are pretty hot. If finding hidden objects is not relaxing enough for you, you also get to decorate your own little tiny island. There is a lot more little surprises and features in the game. Not to mention, I swear to God, this game has the most satisfying sound design. And if you're asking yourselves, important question, are the costumes good? The answer is some of them are actually surprisingly cute, and I wouldn't mind cosplaying one or two characters. Follow the link in the description box below to download June's Journey for free, and I'll see you there. Huh? Now back to less pleasant things, such as what the hell is this hairstyle? Honestly, I love the fact that Peaky Blinders have created a very recognizable style. A style that has actually influenced menswear, like modern menswear in a way, and brought this whole 1920s inspired revival. But there's at least two things about the costumes in the show that really irk me. And one of them, it's not really costumes, but it's part of costuming, is female hairstyles. I don't know why, but it seems to me like, at least in the early seasons, they're going for the typical side characters have actually more historical hair than the leads, because the leads need to appeal to the modern audiences. Which is frustrating because you can tell they know how to make the hair look good, but they feel the need to sexify it. I don't know, add too much spice to it. Like, dude, sometimes too much spice is not good. And when in the later seasons they tend to style the female character's hair a little more, it ends up being super 1930s, which is a bit of a miss because the show starts in 1919, so it's mid-20s at most. You know, like Polly starts off with hair that will work fantastic in 1919 if she was a teenager, and then ends up with an okay mid-1930s hairstyle towards the latter part of the series. Except it's not 1930s, so why? Grace starts off with California beach waves and ends up with a similar style. Gina starts off with caught in the rain floppy hair and ends up with 1940s, so it's all definitely a journey, but not the one I would want to take. The problem a lot of productions struggle with is that vintage hair was often super short. If you look at a typical 1920s hairstyle, either something carefully styled or just like a simple straight bob, it usually doesn't reach past a woman's chin and can often be even shorter. So the problem with period dramas is that it's possible to pin the longer hair up and fake a shorter hairstyle, but it's difficult to fake hair this short. It's difficult to do this when your hair is like past your shoulder. Anyway, the other main thing that irks me is menswear, which, considering 90% of the characters in the show are male, it is a pretty big thing not to get right, you know? This show is based on menswear. Menswear is like the pillar of the show. So now I'm not an expert on 1920s men's clothing, but it just ain't it, you know? First of all, the base of a typical Peaky Blinders male wardrobe is a suit. And I know they're not like high-class aristocrat gentlemen, but even a cheaper 1920s suit would still be pretty structured. I just spat on the camera, that's how enraged I am. And behold, suits at the time were really like tightly fitted. Like to the point it looks too small. The shoulders were narrow, they were sloped, the waist was snatched, the collars were high and really tight, and the waistcoats were fitted, the pants were high-waisted, and the coats were again narrow-shouldered and often belted above the waist. And there is just something about the whole Peaky Blinders look that is very sloppy compared to, you know, photographs from the era. And back then even working class people would rather wear clothing that looks too small. A particularly off element of the male Peaky Blinders outfit for me is the trousers. Like 1920s had a variety of trouser styles, but the series rarely makes them like on point. Not to mention there is a serious lack of +4s in the series. Like you had a perfect opportunity for that. Like that's the working class outfit. Generally speaking, a lot of the styles lean towards honestly the 1940s noir movies, especially the hats and like the wide-shouldered coats. And it might have been intentional because, you know, when we think gangsters, we usually think 1940s noir movies, but it's not the 1940s though. Back to the female costumes, there's a lot of timing inconsistencies that make the whole thing a bit chaotic. I mean, inconsistency when it comes to placing the costumes in the particular time period. Like, even though the first couple of series take place in like early 1920s, the styles are clearly later and sometimes lean on the 1930s side. Or like in the first series, you have on one hand beautiful late Edwardian suit worn by Grace and Polly, and then you have full-on like flapper looks by Ada. Like the volume of the hair alone is very 1930s, not to mention a lot of the dresses with like really accentuated waists. And even Polly's iconic men's suit moment looks very Marlene Dietrich inspired. It's just very 1930s. And I think my problem with that is that 1920s female fashion actually had a lot of menswear inspired moments that were like chef's kiss. So it just seems like a wasted opportunity to explore that and just go for this stereotypical badass 30s lady instead. Especially when the series is clearly supposed to be set in the 20s and it relies on the 20s aesthetic. There is also inconsistency when it comes to differences between they wear and nightwear. Like back then, you know, it was starting to loosen up. What was that accent? It was starting to loosen up, but it was still a very clear line. I don't even know what that is. And throughout the show, there is so many moments when, for absolutely no reason, female characters wear evening gowns during the day. And a gown that is not worn during a summer and doesn't have sleeves, as in it shows over your shoulders, is typically an evening gown. So like, why would you go around wearing that during the day? Not to mention the infuriating use of evening coats during the day. And just to top it off quite literally in this case, there is something a bit off with the hats as well. A lot of men's hats look like they're from a later period, again like 30s, 40s, and women's hats are just sitting not low enough on the head most of the time. I don't know why. Probably because the hair is so big. It's full of secrets. So to me, the costuming in the series is well thought through and well designed, but doesn't fully explore and embrace what the era has to offer. Not to mention because the series focuses on the male characters, the female costumes are less consciously designed, I feel, and the intention behind them isn't as clear as it is with the male costumes. Let's move on to another beloved classic, Anne with an E. You know, let's face it, unlike the previous adaptations, Anne with an E is a pretty modernized version of the story. Like, the creators wanted the modern audience, primarily teenagers and kids, to relate to the character. Someone is walking behind my window, what the hell? But they also took it upon themselves to use the opportunity and educate the audience on modern social issues. This is why I personally take the costume design in this series with a grain of salt, because clearly it's not the idealized late Victorian getaway that we're used to. That being said, A lot of the costumes read very local theater production to me, and like I don't mean it as an offense. Not even the silhouettes, because the show is centered on teenagers, and teenagers back then didn't necessarily wear, you know, the structured garments as grown-ups did. But things like the fabrics, I'm really not a fan of the fabric choices they made in the show, and I really don't like the haberdashery used. You know, the ribbons, the lace, the buttons, etc. I know it's such a nitpicky thing to say, but a lot of it looks like something a beginner costumer would make. And again, don't get me wrong, costumers make wonderful, beautiful things. But when I watch a movie, I'm, you know, usually enjoying the costumes that go a step further than that, achieve something that I probably couldn't make myself. Whereas here it's like, my friend made costumes like these, and they're not high budget costume designers. I don't know, does that sound offensive? I think the school costumes are really cute, but they're a tiny bit too short though. Like even the younger girls, the younger kids at the time wore clothing well below the knees, like usually like half calf. Also, since the series costuming is set at the turn of the century, damn, what a missed opportunity for all the cute young girls' hairstyles the era had to offer. Because the curling iron waves are just not... they're okay. Now, because I don't want to delve too much into it and piss a very passionate fandom off, let's move to Versailles. Oh, let's move on to Versailles. I'm not moving there unless someone wants me to. Versailles is perhaps a little less known than the two previous shows. It's set in 1660s. Why am I lisping today? I mean, it makes a valid effort of showing off how rich men's fashion of the time was, but I feel like considering the royal setting, it's like nowhere near enough. Like, yes, the fabrics used are rich and complex, but it's still lacking the like literal kilograms of decorations and jewels. Why is there a fly there? Same goes for men's shirts, which I personally think are like the weakest point of costuming in the series. There is just not nearly enough volume and fluff and detail involved that the period shirts required. And I think costuming in the show is well reflected in the hairstyles of male leads. Like, the effort was there, but it just falls flat. And same goes for the female costuming. It's not tragic, it has a really nice structure, which I appreciate, you know, I've seen much worse, but it seems like a very mild version of what we could see on the 1660s French court. The fabric choices are questionable sometimes. The torsos could definitely use some additional length in front, and there's just not nearly enough detail to like reflect the era well. So all in all, like, not great, not terrible. I just think that 17th century is too often considered like the more boring prelude to 18th century fashion, and it's just sad because it's an era that has so much to offer fashion-wise. Moving on to Mad Men. Mad Men is set in a very tricky, like, transitional period of fashion between, you know, the class and elegance of the early 60s and the fashion revolution that shook everyone by the end of the decade. Mad Men is a show that actually utilizes a lot of original pieces, which I think is fantastic, but to me it just lacks the structure that made the early 60s so special. First of all, like most shows I've seen set in the 50s and the 60s, the costume department is often afraid of the bullet bra silhouette. It's probably because they think that the spiky rocket boobs are like too distracting or too jarring for the modern audience. But honestly, like once you put clothes on top of it, it looks less scary than you think. And it's honestly such an iconic element of silhouette for the era. And same goes for the girdles actually. The dresses from the era were sometimes boned or structured, but most of the time they kind of relied on a structured girdle that was worn underneath. A girdle will keep the body in the desired shape, and it will, you know, smooth out the tummy rolls and flatten the bum and just take the waist in a little bit. And that is sort of a hit or miss in the series. Like, I think Joanne's pencil dresses is where they definitely pay attention to that. Another thing is the hair. It's my major pet peeve for the era, but one I again understand exists for practical reasons. The hair is always too long. By the early 60s, the hair was a little bit longer than it was in the 50s, that's true, but it was still very short. A typical early 60s hairstyle would probably reach to your chin when styled, like it would be about this long. 1962, baby. And it was usually styled. Of course, it doesn't mean that all women kept their hair really short and styled them all the time, but it's just the statistics, you know? Like, if most people on old photographs have short styled hair, you can probably assume that that was the norm back then. Like that's what majority of women did. It's kind of like people in the future making a show about 2020 where like half of the female cast would have their heads shaved. Like yes, some women have their heads shaved and it's definitely a trend, but it's hardly like an average 2020 hairstyle. And that's something that happens in most media set in that time period. It's that the actresses are not really ready to cut off most of their hair, you know, understandably. And the wigs are expensive and it takes a long time to put them on. If the wig is really short, you also have to spend a lot of time hiding the hair underneath well, so it's not just like the giant head. So the hair just ends up being longer than it should be in most cases. Like the same thing happened in shows like the early seasons of The Crown. While we're at this particular time period, let's move on to Mrs. Maisel. I know you may be surprised why a show like this, a show with such exquisite costuming and thought behind it, made it to the video. And it's honestly so subjective and it's so nitpicky of me, but let's just talk about it. So unlike Mad Men, Mrs. Maisel's costumes, especially the main character ones, they seem to be made especially for the series. And there's just something about the silhouette that makes me think of modern wedding dresses where the waist is just like slightly too low. And you know, even if that's the actress's actual figure and actual silhouette, as a person whose waist sits at the level of like an average person's knees, I have to say it is possible to sort of fake it. Like when I'm wearing an original 50s or 60s dress, the waist always sits a little higher than my actual waist, which in turn gives my body the fashionable silhouette. Like the proportions are just there. And something that also happens again is just the right shape of bra, which gives you this conical torso. Now when you have neither the shorter waist nor the conical bra, you just start messing with these proportions and things can start looking a little odd, if you ask me. So it might be nitpicking on my part, but it's just frustrating when something is so close to looking genuinely great, but like lightly misses the mark. And if they just, you know, raise the waistline by like 10 centimeters and maybe allow some more space in the top of the dress for a more conical shape and maybe shorten the hair a little bit, it will honestly achieve like the perfect historical look. It's just so close. So yeah, I think these are all the shows that I wanted to discuss today. I hope you're not upset with me because, as I said, I genuinely believe most of these shows do a good job of portraying the period, but they just could try like a little bit harder to fulfill its potential fully. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and do remember what we discussed at the beginning? I said don't forget to download June's Journey for free using the link in the description box, and maybe I'll see you there. Thank you.